South Park has produced over 300 episodes across nearly 3 decades. Some of them are among the best half hours of television ever made, and some of them are what you are about to spend the next several hours listening to. This video is not about the episodes that offended people, or the ones that got pulled from streaming, or the ones that started arguments. Those episodes at least had energy, at least had a reason to exist. This video is about the other ones, the ones that confused their own creators, the ones that arrived years too late to say anything relevant, the ones that were built around characters nobody asked to see and ideas that ran out of steam before the first commercial break. 12 episodes, 12 different ways a show this good managed to get it this wrong. Welcome to East Park. If long-form content like this is your thing, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it helps more than you know. Now let us get into it. The April Fool that started a riot. Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus. Season 2, Episode 1, 1998. It is April 1st, 1998. You are a South Park fan sitting in front of your television. Season 1 ended months ago, on one of the biggest cliffhangers the show had ever produced. The whole mystery driving that finale was a single question every fan wanted answered. Who is Cartman's father? The Season 1 finale, called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, spent its entire runtime building toward that reveal. And then, right at the moment of truth, the episode cut to black. No answer. Just a promise that Season 2 would deliver what fans had been waiting for. So there you are. Season 2, Episode 1. You have been waiting months for this. You sit down, you press play, and what appears on screen is not Stan, not Kyle, not Cartman, not Kenny. What appears on screen is Terrence and Phillip, 2 Canadian cartoon characters who exist inside South Park's world as a show that the boys watch on their television. They are not main characters. They are barely even side characters in any meaningful way. They exist as a joke about crude humor, 2 men who fart at each other for laughs. And Parker and Stone gave these 2 the entire Season 2 premiere, all 22 minutes of it. No main cast, no Cartman mystery resolution, just farts. The reaction from fans was immediate and volcanic. People were furious. Online forums at the time filled up with angry posts from viewers who felt genuinely tricked. Not in a fun way, in the way that makes you feel like the people who make a show you love have just laughed in your face. South Park had built real momentum coming out of Season 1. It had become a genuine cultural phenomenon by that point. The kind of show people talked about at school on Monday morning, the kind of show that was everywhere. And the Season 2 premiere was the moment that would either hold all of that momentum or waste it. Parker and Stone used that moment to air 22 minutes of 2 characters nobody cared about doing a joke that had already worn thin within the first 5 minutes. What makes this even more layered is the fact that Parker and Stone knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a mistake. This was not a case of the show running out of time to finish the Cartman storyline. This was a deliberate April Fool's prank, timed specifically to air on April 1st so that the date itself was part of the joke. The creators sat down, decided that the single most anticipated episode of their show's young run would be replaced with a Terrence and Phillip special, and they committed to it completely. The episode has no connection to the Cartman cliffhanger at all. It does not even acknowledge that the cliffhanger exists. It simply drops the audience into 22 minutes of Canadian fart humor and moves on as if nothing happened. The plot of the episode, to the extent that it has one, follows Terrence and Phillip trying to stop Saddam Hussein from taking over Canada. That is the entire story. Terrence farts, Phillip farts, Saddam Hussein shows up, Canada is saved. The end. There is nothing else there. The show within a show that Parker and Stone had been using as a running gag, a way of poking fun at crude, low-effort comedy, became the actual episode. The joke about bad television was the television. Now here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Years later, in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, Matt Stone said something that most people did not see coming. He called this episode his favorite South Park episode ever made. His exact reasoning was that the fact nobody else liked it made him love it more. That is a very specific kind of defiance. Stone was not defending the episode on quality grounds. He was not saying the Terrence and Phillip story was secretly brilliant, or that the fart jokes were deeper than people realized. He was saying that the episode's rejection by fans was itself the thing he found most satisfying about it. The prank worked too well. The audience hated it, and that made Stone proud of it. Parker's relationship with the episode is a little more complicated. Parker has been on record saying that the early seasons of South Park, seasons 1 through 3 specifically, are seasons he is not proud of and would erase if he could. He has not singled out this particular episode for special praise the way Stone did, but he also has not apologized for it. The official position from the creative side of the show has always been that it was the prank it was meant to be, and the fury it produced was the intended outcome. What the episode actually did to South South Park as a show is worth thinking about. The Cartman cliffhanger did eventually get resolved in the very next episode. Cartman's mom is still a dirty slut, which aired 1 week later. That resolution, which itself became a whole other story, at least gave fans what they had been waiting for. But the damage to trust was already done in a specific way. Viewers learned something from this prank that changed how they engaged with South Park going forward. This was a show that would absolutely mess with you if it felt like it. Parker and Stone were not interested in managing fan expectations or delivering what audiences wanted when it suited them to do something else instead. That attitude, total creative freedom, zero obligation to the audience's comfort, became a defining characteristic of how South Park operated for decades afterward. The episode currently holds a 6.1 out of 10 on IMDb, based on nearly 4,600 votes. That makes it the single lowest rated South Park episode in the show's entire history by that particular measure. A number that low on a show as broadly popular as South Park is genuinely unusual. For comparison, even the episodes that fans consider weak usually sit somewhere in the 7s. A 6.1 means a very significant portion of the people who voted actively disliked it, rather than simply finding it forgettable. It is also worth noting what this episode is not. It is not offensive in the way that gets South Park episodes pulled from streaming or banned in certain countries. It is not dark in the way that some of the show's most controversial episodes are dark. It is not morally complicated or politically charged. It is just an episode about two Canadian men farting at each other for 22 minutes while Saddam Hussein tries to take over Canada. That is it. The fury it produced was not about content. It was about expectation. Fans were not upset by what the episode contained. They were upset by what it replaced. That distinction matters when you are ranking the worst South Park has to offer. Some episodes on this list are going to be difficult to watch because of what they put on screen. This one is difficult to talk about because of what it chose to withhold. It is a prank episode, born from a specific creative impulse, timed deliberately, and executed exactly as intended. The problem is that a prank episode airing in place of one of the most anticipated episodes the show had ever built toward is not funny to the people being pranked. It is just frustrating. And the frustration lasted. Over 2 decades later, this episode still shows up at the top of worst South Park lists across the internet. Not because people have forgotten about it, but because the memory of sitting down expecting Cartman's father reveal and getting Canadian fart jokes instead is the kind of memory that does not go away. It is permanently attached to a specific feeling of being let down by something you were genuinely excited about. Parker and Stone built an entire career out of not caring what people thought of their choices. This episode was the first real proof of that, and depending on who you ask, that is either the most South Park thing they ever did, or the moment the show almost lost the audience it had spent an entire first season earning. __quote_1__. What comes next on this list is a different kind of failure entirely. Not a prank, not a deliberate provocation, just an episode that went so wrong so completely that even the people who made it wanted to pretend it never existed. And the proof is in their own words. Section 2, the lowest rated episode ever. Quote 2, S10E5 2006. There is a specific kind of bad episode that is worse than one that offends you or one that bores you. It is the kind where you sit there watching it and genuinely cannot figure out what you are supposed to be feeling. Not because it is deep or confusing in an interesting way, but because nothing on screen makes sense as a piece of television, and the people who made it seem to have lost track of what show they were making somewhere in the middle of production. That is exactly what happened with A Million Little Fibers, and the numbers back it up. This episode sits at a 6.1 out of 10 on IMDb, matching the April Fool's episode from Section 1 as the lowest rated South Park episode the show has ever produced. Out of over 300 episodes spanning more than 2 decades, this is the bottom. And the most remarkable thing about it is that the creators themselves agree. The episode aired on April 19, 2006 during Season 10, which is widely considered one of the stronger seasons in the show's run. Season 10 contains Make Love Not Warcraft, which won South Park an Emmy. It contains Cartoon Wars, which is one of the most talked about episodes in the show's history. And sandwiched between those genuinely celebrated episodes is A Million Little Fibers, which Trey Parker described by saying, "That did not turn out well." Matt Stone went further, calling it weird on top of weird with weird in the middle, and saying he would erase it entirely if he could. Those are the words of the people who wrote it, produced it, and put it on television. They are not defending it. They are not asking you to give it another chance. They want it gone. So what is it actually about. Towley, the talking, pot-smoking towel character introduced in Season 5, gets fired from his job at a restaurant called P.F. Chang's because he shows up to work completely high and cannot function. Broke and unemployed, he decides to write his life story. He types up a memoir called A Million Little Fibers. But when he tries to get it published, the publisher turns him down immediately because nobody wants to read the autobiography of a towel. So Towley gets high again, comes up with a new plan, and resubmits the manuscript under a fake human name, Stephen McTowley. The book gets accepted. It becomes a massive bestseller. Oprah Winfrey selects it as her book of the month and has Towley on her show. The book flies off shelves and Towley becomes famous. That is one storyline. Here is the other one running at the same time. Oprah Winfrey's vagina, named Minge, is upset because Oprah is always working and never pays attention to it. Oprah's anus, named Gary, gets involved. The two of them hatch a plan to expose Towley as a towel, which they believe will get Oprah fired from her own show, which means Oprah will have more free time to spend with them. Minge contacts journalist Geraldo Rivera and leaks the information. The news breaks. Oprah turns on Towley. A mob forms. Towley gets cornered outside a bank in Chicago. Minge pulls out a gun, shoots a police officer, and takes the crowd hostage. Eventually, a police sniper shoots Gary. Minge, devastated by Gary's death, shoots himself. Oprah is taken to the hospital. Towley is declared a hero. Read that back. That is the episode. Now, the satirical idea underneath all of this is not completely without logic. The episode is a parody of a real controversy that was happening at the time. In 2005 and 2006, a writer named James Fry had published a memoir called A Million Little Pieces. The title of the South Park episode is a direct reference to this. Oprah Winfrey had put the book on her Book of the Month list and championed it publicly. It then came out that Fry had fabricated large portions of the memoir. Oprah brought Fry back on her show specifically to confront and criticize him in front of her audience. The South Park episode is built around that real sequence of events, with Towley standing in for James Fry. That satirical foundation actually works on paper. The problem is everything built on top of it. Towley was never designed to carry an episode on his own. The character was introduced as a one-joke concept, a talking towel who gets high and gives useless advice. He exists as a background gag, not as a lead. Parker and Stone have even described the character as something they created partly as a joke about the over-marketing of South Park merchandise. Towley was a self-aware comment on the fact that the show was putting its characters on everything from t-shirts to stuffed animals. A character whose entire existence is a commentary on shallow commercialization is not a character built for emotional depth or narrative weight. Putting him at the center of a full episode and asking him to carry the whole thing by himself was always going to be a problem. The episode is also one of only 2 South Park episodes in the entire history of the series where Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny do not appear at all. Not in the background, not for a single frame. The only other episode to do this is Pip, which will be covered in Section 3, and which Parker has described using almost identical language. Both episodes make the same fundamental error. They remove the characters people actually watch the show for and replace them with someone who cannot hold the screen alone. Parker and Stone describe the production of this episode in their commentary using the image of wearing 2 hats on top of each other. Their point was that when you stack one hat on another, you do not end up with a better hat. You just look like someone who does not know how to wear a hat. The 2 storylines in this episode, Towley's James Fry parody and Oprah's sentient body parts holding people at gunpoint, are 2 separate hats stacked on top of each other with nothing connecting them. Neither story makes the other better. They just sit there on top of each other, making the whole thing harder to watch. The production history of the episode makes the final result easier to understand, even if it does not make the episode easier to sit through. A Million Little Fibers was originally planned as the season's bank episode, which means it was supposed to be partially produced in advance before the main production run began, giving the writing team a small window of extra time during the season. The original concept was a parody of the real television series Intervention, a show where friends and family stage formal confrontations with people struggling with addiction. In that version, the people of South Park would stage an intervention for Towley to get him off drugs. About 10 minutes of that episode had already been animated when Parker and Stone decided it was not good enough and needed more work than the schedule could allow. So they scrapped it entirely and started from scratch. That scrapped intervention concept was not thrown away permanently. Parker and Stone held onto it and eventually used it as the foundation for the season 14 episode Crippled Summer, which aired 4 years later. The fact that the original idea was good enough to become its own successful episode later makes the decision to abandon it in favor of what became A Million Little Fibers even more striking in hindsight. The finished episode was completed in less time than usual, partly because the team had already taken their scheduled break before realizing the first version was not working. The result is an episode that feels rushed, unfinished, and disconnected. Because in a very real sense, it was all three of those things. Two storylines were thrown together under deadline pressure, neither of which had been fully developed, and the combination produced something that even the creators could not defend. Parker's own words on the episode are worth sitting with again. He said he had higher hopes for it. He said that if the show was going to do a storyline involving Oprah's body parts holding people hostage, it should have been built around the four main boys, not Towley. That is the clearest diagnosis of what went wrong. The crude, bizarre, escalating absurdity of Oprah's sentient vagina pulling out a gun and shooting a police officer is exactly the kind of thing South Park does well, but only when the show's actual characters are there to react to it, comment on it, and give the audience something familiar to hold on to while the world around them falls apart. Without Stan or Cartman or Kyle standing there watching Oprah's anatomy commit armed robbery, the scene has no anchor. It is just strange, and strange without purpose does not land the same way. Stone's version of the same criticism is even more direct. He said the episode made him feel like he had tuned in to watch South Park and ended up watching something else entirely. That is a specific and honest complaint. Not that the episode was offensive or badly animated, but that it did not feel like the show it was supposed to be. It did not feel like South Park. It felt like something unfamiliar wearing South Park's clothes. The episode has a 6.1 on IMDb. It is the joint lowest score in the show's history, and unlike the April Fool's episode from Section 1, which was a deliberate prank with a clear creative intention behind it, A Million Little Fibers has no such defense. It was not trying to provoke anyone. It was not making a point about audience expectations. It just did not work. The idea did not come together. The production fell apart, the replacement concept was put together too quickly, and the result is 22 minutes of television that even its own creators look back on with regret. Towley did eventually return in later episodes, handled much more effectively in smaller doses. The intervention concept that was scrapped from this episode became a genuinely well-received episode when it was finally made properly in season 14, and A Million Little Fibers remains the episode that Parker and Stone wish they could take back. The one that produced not a single moment either of them is proud of. Built around a character neither of them could quite figure out how to use, structured around two storylines that should never have been in the same episode. The lowest score in the show's history. The creator's own words calling it a mistake. An episode that does not feel like the show it belongs to. That combination is what earns this episode the top spot on the factual rankings. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What comes next is a different situation entirely. The creators admit they hate that one too, but for a completely different set of reasons, and with one extra layer that makes the whole story stranger. Because at least A Million Little Fibers was trying to be South Park. The next episode on this list was not even trying to be the same show. Section 3. Even the creators hate it. Pip, Season 4, Episode 14, 2000. There is a character in South Park who appears in the background of classroom scenes, gets bullied constantly, never drives a single storyline that matters, and is so universally disliked that even the people who created him openly say they cannot stand him. His name is Pip. He is a British kid, he wears a flat cap, speaks politely, gets pushed around by everyone including the main boys, and exists on the edges of the show without ever becoming anything more than a face in the crowd. He appeared in the unaired pilot, he showed up in early episodes, he was technically a recurring character for several seasons, and then, slowly, and without much ceremony, he disappeared, replaced in every meaningful way by Butters, who took over the role of the mild-mannered, easily victimized kid who gets dragged into situations he cannot handle. Parker and Stone themselves said in commentary for the episode Two Guys Naked in a Hot Tub that Butters was simply a better character than Pip. So naturally, someone decided to give Pip his own episode. Pip aired on November 29, 2000. It is Season 4, Episode 14, the 62nd episode of the series overall, and it holds a distinction that makes it genuinely unique in the history of South Park. It is one of only 2 episodes in the entire run of the show where Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny do not appear. Not in the background, not for a single line of dialogue, not even as a brief visual. The four boys who are the entire reason anyone watches South Park are completely absent from this episode. The only other episode to do the same thing is A Million Little Fibers from Section 2, and as already established, Parker and Stone consider that one of the worst things they ever made. The premise of Pip is a retelling of Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations. For anyone who has not read it, Great Expectations is a classic English story about an orphaned boy named Pip who grows up poor, falls in love with a girl above his social class, and is mysteriously given money to become a gentleman. It was written in 1861. Parker and Stone had apparently wanted to do a Great Expectations parody since the very beginning of the series. The character of Pip, already named after the Dickens protagonist, already British, already an orphan of sorts within the show's world, seemed like a natural fit for it. The problem is that what ended up on screen is less a South Park episode and more a straightforward retelling of the Dickens novel with a few added absurdities bolted on. There are robot monkeys, there is a device that can swap bodies. Miss Havisham, the bitter, jilted woman from the original novel, uses Pip's tears to power a machine that will allow her to take revenge on all men. These additions are technically strange enough to qualify as South Park-style weirdness, but they sit on top of a story that otherwise follows the source material quite closely, which creates a very specific problem. The episode is too faithful to Dickens to feel like South Park, and too weird to function as a genuine adaptation of Dickens. It falls into the space between the two without belonging to either one. The episode was narrated in live action by Malcolm McDowell, the actor famous for his role in the 1971 film A Clockwork Orange, playing a character described only as a British person. McDowell appeared on camera in segments filmed to look like a parody of Masterpiece Theater, a television series that presented classic literary adaptations. Parker and Stone said they made this choice having learned a lesson from the Terrence and Phillip April Fool's episode from season 2. After that episode aired without any warning that the main cast would be absent, fans felt blindsided. For Pip, they wanted to signal up front, through McDowell's live-action introduction, that this was going to be a completely different experience from a normal South Park episode, and that viewers should not expect to see the regular characters at any point. The decision to cast McDowell was genuinely positive on a personal level. Parker and Stone both spoke highly of the experience of working with him. McDowell spent time on set telling stories about filming A Clockwork Orange, and about working with its director Stanley Kubrick. By all accounts, it was a pleasant production for the people involved. McDowell himself spoke warmly of Parker and Stone. None of that warmth translated into an episode that worked. The production itself was unusually long by South Park standards. Because the episode was set in 19th century England, a completely different visual world from the show's normal Colorado mountain town setting, almost every asset had to be built from scratch. New character designs, new backgrounds, new locations. This took months. South Park episodes are typically written and produced within the same week they air, which is one of the most extraordinary things about how the show operates. Pip broke that pattern significantly. The extended production did not result in a better episode. It resulted in an episode that looks noticeably different from everything around it, feels disconnected from the show's identity, and still did not manage to be funny enough to justify the extra effort. Parker's position on the episode is about as clear as a creator's position on their own work can get. He said, "Everyone, including us, hates Pip." That is a complete sentence with no hedging, no qualification, and no attempt to find a silver lining. Everyone, including us. Stone's version was slightly softer, but pointed in the same direction. He said, "I don't hate it, but it was like, why did you guys do that?" Stone is not defending the episode. He is simply refusing to claim personal hatred, while still acknowledging that the creative decision behind it made no sense. "Why did you guys do that?" is not a ringing endorsement. It is bewilderment expressed politely. The episode has been rerun very infrequently on Comedy Central since its original airing. That is a meaningful detail. South Park episodes get repeated constantly. It is part of how Comedy Central has always operated, cycling through the library on a regular rotation. The fact that Pip rarely shows up in that rotation suggests a quiet institutional acknowledgement that this is not an episode the network is eager to put in front of people. It is also the only South Park episode in the series that does not include the show's standard disclaimer card at the beginning. The one that says the episode contains coarse language and adult content and is not suitable for children. Whether this was a deliberate choice or simply an oversight during production is not documented, but it stands as another small way the episode exists slightly outside the normal boundaries of what South Park is. Parker and Stone have also pointed out a structural problem with the episode that goes beyond the creative choices they made. Pip the character simply cannot carry carry an episode. He is one-dimensional in a way that was always fine when he was a background presence. His politeness and his tendency to get pushed around worked as texture, as a recurring joke, as a face in a crowd. But those qualities are not enough to build a story around. There is no tension in a character who accepts everything that happens to him. There is no comedy in a character whose defining trait is being nice. South Park's best episodes work because the characters at the center of them have strong, identifiable, often contradictory personalities that create friction. Cartman's selfishness crashing into Kyle's sense of justice, Stan's decency getting overwhelmed by the world's absurdity. Pip has none of that friction. He is just kind and unfortunate, and 22 minutes of kind and unfortunate is very difficult to make interesting. The comparison to A Million Little Fibers is worth making directly. Both episodes are built around side characters who were never designed to anchor a full story. Both remove the four main boys entirely. Both were produced under unusual circumstances. Pip through an extended multi-month production, A Million Little Fibers through a last-minute scramble after the original concept was thrown out. And both are openly acknowledged by their creators as failures. The fact that the two lowest points in South Park's history share this specific structure, wrong character at the center, no main boys, unusual production, is not a coincidence. It is a clear lesson about what the show needs to function. After the Pip episode aired, the character of Pip gradually disappeared from the show. His role shrank. His appearances became rarer. Butters took over the narrative space Pip had been occupying in the early seasons. Pip made one last speaking appearance in the episode Professor Chaos, where he was among a group of potential new friends for the boys. He appeared in the background of various episodes after that, and then in the season 14 episode 201, he was killed, crushed by the foot of Mecha Streisand, a giant monster version of Barbra Streisand that the show had used years earlier. It was not a ceremonial send-off. It was not treated as a significant moment. Pip just died in a crowd scene and was not mentioned again. The show had already moved on from him long before that happened. The character's total speaking role across the entire series was 15 episodes. His own episode is the one most people remember, and it is remembered specifically as an episode that did not work. There is something genuinely strange about that. A character gets his own spotlight, his own story, his own 22 minutes of screen time, and the result is the episode that most firmly established why he should not have been a character at all. Parker said it himself. Everyone hates Pip. Not the episode, the character. The episode just made that feeling official. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the next section on this list different from the previous two is intent. Parker and Stone made Pip because they had an idea they thought could work, and it did not. They made A Million Little Fibers because they ran out of time and threw two half-finished ideas together. Both failures came from genuine creative attempts that fell apart. But the episode coming up next was designed to fail on purpose, and the failure it produced was so thorough, so complete, that even the people who built it specifically to be bad were surprised by just how badly it landed. Section 4, deliberately designed to annoy you. Jackovasaurs, S3E4, 1999. Most bad television episodes are bad by accident. The writers had an idea that did not come together. The production ran out of time. The joke went on too long. The story lost its focus somewhere in the middle and never found it again. These are the normal ways episodes fail. Through miscalculation, through deadline pressure, through creative choices that seemed reasonable in the writer's room and did not survive contact with an actual audience. The episodes covered so far in this video fall into that category. Pip was a genuine attempt that did not work. A Million Little Fibers was a production that collapsed under its own weight. The April Fool's episode was a prank that went further than even its creators expected. Jackovasaurs is something completely different from all of those. Jackovasaurs was designed from the ground up to be as annoying as possible. That was not a side effect of what the episode became. It was the entire point. Parker and Stone sat down and made a deliberate decision to create the most irritating characters ever put on television. They built the episode around that goal. They wrote it with that goal in mind. They produced it with that goal in mind. And then they aired it and watched an audience react with exactly the kind of anger and frustration they had engineered the episode to produce. The question is whether doing that on purpose makes it better or worse. And the answer, based on nearly every review and fan response the episode has ever received, is that it makes it worse. much worse. The episode aired on June 16, 1999. It is Season 3, Episode 4, the 35th episode of the series overall. And the reason Parker and Stone wanted to create the most annoying characters in television history traces back directly to a movie that had come out 4 weeks earlier. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, arrived in theaters in May 1999. Parker and Stone were Star Wars fans. They had grown up with the original trilogy the way millions of people had. It was part of their cultural foundation, part of what shaped their sense of what storytelling could be. And when The Phantom Menace arrived, it contained a character that made them feel, in their own words, betrayed. That character was Jar Jar Binks. Jar Jar Binks is a tall, orange, floppy-eared alien from a planet called Naboo. He was designed as comic relief for younger audiences. He speaks in a broken, exaggerated accent, moves clumsily, trips over things, knocks things down, and says things like Mesa and Yusa instead of I and you. He was intended to be lovable and funny. The reaction to him was the opposite of that. From the moment trailers for The Phantom Menace started circulating, audiences who had seen early footage of Jar Jar were already concerned. Parker and Stone saw those trailers and told each other that people were going to hate that character. They were right. Jar Jar Binks became one of the most disliked characters in blockbuster movie history almost immediately after the film released. Criticized for being irritating, childish, and out of place in a story that was supposed to be serious science fiction, Parker and Stone's response to this was to dedicate an entire South Park episode to expressing how they felt about it. Stone described the thinking directly. The whole idea behind this episode was to make the Jacovosaur the most annoying character ever put on TV. He added that for this reason, some people do not like the episode very much because it just annoys them too much. But that was kind of the point. Parker confirmed the same thing. It was supposed to annoy you. He was supposed to annoy you. There was also a second reason the episode existed, beyond pure creative frustration with Jar Jar. Earlier that same year, Parker and Stone had created a Jar Jar Binks parody specifically for the MTV Movie Awards. They had a plan. They had material ready. They were going to air it, and MTV refused to let them do it. The reason, according to Stone, was that MTV's major advertisers at the time included companies that were heavily invested in the Star Wars brand. The Phantom Menace was one of the biggest movies of the year, and the companies paying MTV to advertise did not want a parody of its most prominent character airing on the network, so the segment was pulled. Parker and Stone were told no, and they did not have a way to fight it. Jacovosaurs was partly the result of that blocked creative energy finding another outlet. They could not mock Jar Jar on MTV, so they built their own version of Jar Jar and put it in their own show where nobody could stop them. The episode also aired at one of the most chaotic moments in the show's own production history. South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, the South Park feature film, was releasing on June 30th, 1999, just 2 weeks after this episode aired. Parker was simultaneously finishing the sound mix for the movie while this episode was being produced and aired. Stone directed the episode himself, which was unusual. It was his last time directing a South Park episode until the episode Cupid Ye aired in 2023, a gap of over 2 decades. The fact that this is the episode Stone directed under those circumstances, while Parker was occupied with the film, adds another layer to the story of how it came together. The Jacovosaurs themselves are large, yellow, duck-like creatures with human bodies. They speak in a loud, clumsy way that mimics Jar Jar Binks' speech pattern. The female Jacovosaurs communicate almost entirely through a sound described as ooh-wop. Their name is a combination of 2 words, the phrase jack off, which is a crude expression, and the word dinosaur. Parker and Stone were not subtle about what they were building. The creatures were designed to be visually unappealing in their movement, irritating in their sound, and exhausting in their presence. The episode's entire structure is built around a single joke. These creatures are unbearable. Everyone in South Park finds them unbearable, and yet circumstances keep forcing the town to deal with them anyway. The plot follows the boys discovering what appears to be a previously unknown species while camping at Stark's Pond. The government gets involved and decides the Jacovosaurs must be protected as an endangered species. Dr. Mephisto, a recurring scientist character in the show, determines that the creatures have no genitals and cannot reproduce naturally, so he artificially inseminates the female Jacovosaur, named June June. She gives birth to an entire litter of baby jackovasaurs within 4 days. The town, which had already found the creatures exhausting, now has significantly more of them to deal with. Cartman, uniquely, loves the jackovasaurs. He is the only character in South Park who genuinely enjoys their company. This detail is actually one of the more interesting creative choices in the episode. Parker and Stone giving Cartman a soft spot for the exact creatures that everyone else cannot stand is a character-consistent move. Cartman has always had a specific relationship with things that other people find intolerable, and his attachment to the jackovasaurs tracks with how the character works. But even that genuinely clever choice cannot save what surrounds it. The town eventually tries to get rid of the jackovasaurs by convincing them to move to Memphis. When Cartman discovers this plan and stops it, the town comes up with a different approach, rigging a game show so that Yakov, the male jackovasaur, wins a trip to France along with 50 of his closest relatives. The plan nearly fails because Yakov is so unintelligent that Officer Barbrady, who is himself not known for being smart, actually wins the rigged game honestly. The town simply declares Yakov the winner anyway because everyone wants them gone. The French, it turns out, love the Yakovasaurs and find their antics hilarious, comparing Yakov to the American comedian Jerry Lewis, whose slapstick style of comedy was historically far more popular in France than in the United States. The ending is one of the few moments in the episode that lands as intended. The Yakovasaurs fitting perfectly into French culture is a specific joke that works. But it takes the entire episode to get there, and the journey is exactly what Parker and Stone promised. Exhausting, repetitive, and built around characters whose defining characteristic is that they make you want to stop watching. The episode holds a 6.4 out of 10 on IMDb. Some reviewers gave it partial credit for the intentionality behind it. If the goal was to make the most annoying thing possible, they technically succeeded. IGN's review at the time gave the episode a 6 out of 10, and noted specifically that the Jacovasaur joke went on for too long, which is both accurate and somewhat ironic, given that the joke going on too long was built into its design. The more important critical point is the one Screen Rant made years later. The episode annoyed even the people who already hated Jar Jar Binks. The target audience for this joke was people who were frustrated with the Phantom Menace, and even those people found the episode too much to sit through. That is a specific failure. When your parody of an annoying thing is more annoying than the annoying thing it is parodying, the parody has not worked. Parker and Stone themselves acknowledged this. They said they had tried to make something more irritating than Jar Jar and felt the finished product still was not quite as annoying as the real thing. Whether that is a confession of failure or a backhanded defense of Jar Jar Binks is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that Jacovasaurs never appeared again in any meaningful way after this episode. Jakov made a small cameo appearance at the end of the episode I'm a Little Bit Country in Season 7, visible in the crowd. The creatures showed up briefly in background scenes in The Biggest Douche in the Universe. They eventually appeared as enemies in the South Park video game Snow Day, released decades later, but the show never returned to them as characters. They were sent to France and left there permanently, which is the most dignified outcome an episode this deliberately unpleasant could have asked for. Cartman's song from this episode, in which he sings about hating the other boys while they try to distract him, has been cited by fans as one of the genuinely funny moments the episode produces. It is a small bright spot in 22 minutes that were engineered to have as few bright spots as possible. __quote_7__. The next episode on this list is a completely different situation. No deliberate provocation, no creative revenge against a movie studio. Just a season finale that went so dark, so cheerlessly, that viewers left feeling worse than when they sat down, and the creators themselves could not agree on whether that was a failure or the whole point. Section 5. The season finale that depressed everyone. Quote 8. Season 10, Episode 14, 2006. Season finales are supposed to mean something. They are the last episode a show puts out before going off the air for months. They are the moment the writers have the most room to be bold, to take risks, to send the audience away with something that stays with them. The best South Park finales do exactly that. They end a season on a note that feels earned, whether that note is funny or strange or both at the same time. Season 10 had been one of the strongest runs the show had produced. It contained Cartoon Wars. It contained Make Love Not Warcraft, which won the show an Emmy. It contained Go God Go, a two-part story set in the distant future that is among the most ambitious things the show had attempted up to that point. Season 10 was, by any reasonable measure, South Park operating close to its its best. And then it ended with Stanley's Cup. The episode aired on November 15th, 2006. It is season 10, episode 14, the 153rd episode of the series overall, and the final episode of the season. It was written and directed by Trey Parker. The premise is a direct parody of a very specific kind of sports movie, the underdog story. The Mighty Ducks, released in 1992, is the most obvious reference point. In that film, a reluctant coach takes over a losing youth hockey team, bonds with the kids, and leads them to an unlikely victory through hard work and belief. It is a formula that has been used in dozens of movies. The coach starts out unwilling, the kids are terrible. Through effort and connection and a few inspiring speeches, everything comes together. The big game arrives. Against all odds, the team wins. Everyone learns something. The credits roll. Stanley's Cup takes that formula and does something very specific with it. It follows the formula exactly, and then refuses the ending. Stan Marsh has his bicycle towed because of unpaid parking tickets. His boss at his paperboy job is unhappy with his performance. Stan appeals to have his bike returned and is told by the relevant authority that the only way to get it back is to coach the Park County Pee Wee hockey team. So Stan becomes a reluctant youth hockey coach despite knowing nothing about hockey. He meets the team. They are very young, very small, and genuinely terrible at the sport. One of the children on the team is named Nelson, and Nelson is dying of cancer. He is bald from his treatment, he is visibly sick, and his one wish is to see his team win. Everything about this setup is pulled directly from the underdog sports movie blueprint. The reluctant coach, the lovable but hopeless team, the terminally ill child whose hope for a victory gives the whole story its emotional weight. Parker and Stone constructed the episode to feel exactly like one of those movies for as long as possible. They wanted the audience inside the formula. They wanted the familiar shape of the story to create an expectation. The team will improve, the big game will arrive, and somehow, against impossible odds, these small, sick children will find a way to win. The big game arrives, and Stan's Pee Wee team plays the actual Detroit Red Wings. Not another Pee Wee team, not a slightly older or slightly better group of children, the Detroit Red Wings. A professional NHL team made up of adult professional hockey players. The mismatch is total and immediate. Small children on skates against professional athletes. The score ends up 32-2. The children are not just defeated, they are physically overwhelmed on the ice. The audience in the stands watches this happen and begins chanting, "Let them play, let them play," not as encouragement for the children, but as a demand that the adults on the ice stop holding back and simply play their actual game against a group of kids. Stan stands on the sideline watching everything fall apart. He has no inspiring speech that changes anything. There is no rally, there is no miracle. The children lose catastrophically, and Nelson, the child with cancer who wanted more than anything to see his team win, watches all of this happen and then dies. That is the ending of the episode. That is the season finale of season 10. Parker and Stone were aware that this ending was going to land badly with a large portion of the audience. Their defense of it, recorded in the episode's audio commentary, is one of the more interesting pieces of creator self-reflection in the show's history. Parker said, "A lot of people didn't get that one. We thought the ending was really sweet and weird, but nobody really got it." Stone's version of the same thought was, "The hockey one is like 3/4 of a show, but the ending is really something." Both of them found the ending genuinely funny and genuinely moving in a specific dark way. The joke, as they understood it, was that the underdog sports movie formula is a lie, a comfortable, predictable story that real life does not actually deliver. The Detroit Red Wings are not going to let a Pee Wee team beat them out of sentimentality. A sick child's wish for his team to win does not change the laws of how sport works. The ending of Stanley's Cup is, in Parker and Stone's view, the honest version of the story that the Mighty Ducks was not willing to tell. The audience largely did not receive it that way. The response from fans was more straightforwardly negative than almost any other episode in the show's run. Viewers described the episode as mean-spirited, bleak, and unsatisfying. The specific complaint was not that the children lost. South Park had always been comfortable putting its characters through terrible experiences. The complaint was that there was no counterweight to the darkness. When South Park puts Kenny through something horrible, there is usually something funny or absurd or pointed happening at the same time that gives the darkness a purpose. surface. In Stanley's Cup, the darkness is just the ending. There is nothing else there. Nelson dies, the children lose 32-2, Stan gets nothing resolved, the credits roll. The production history of the episode adds important context to why the ending landed the way it did. Stanley's Cup existed as the season's bank episode, meaning it was supposed to be partially produced in advance to give the writing team breathing room during the main production run. But Parker and Stone found themselves unable to finish it. Every time they returned to the episode to complete it, something about it was not working and they could not identify what. It kept getting set aside. The production run for the second half of season 10 moved forward without the bank episode ever being completed, which meant the team had no buffer period, no scheduled days off during that entire stretch. Stone compared the experience to childbirth. Parker said the difficulty of finishing that season could have resulted in the show being canceled entirely if things had gone differently. By the time the season reached its final episode slot, Stanley's Cup was the only thing available to fill it. So it was finished under maximum deadline pressure and aired as the season finale without Parker and Stone ever fully resolving what was bothering them about it. The episode has specific structural problems that even sympathetic viewers tend to acknowledge. Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny are completely absent from the episode. Stan is present, but the three other boys who normally provide the show's core dynamic simply do not appear. Kyle shows up for a single scene with a handful of lines and then disappears. Cartman's absence is particularly noticeable. His commentary on the situation, his reaction to Stan's predicament, his presence at the final game would have given the episode something to push against. Without him, the episode has no friction. It is just Stan being miserable in a series of increasingly bad situations with no one to bounce off. The episode also loses track of its own setup. Stan's bicycle, the entire reason he is coaching the team in the first place, stops being mentioned after the first few minutes. The stakes that the episode establishes for Stan personally are abandoned before the story even reaches its midpoint. This creates a structural gap where the audience is watching Stan care about something without being entirely clear why he still cares about it or what he is actually trying to achieve beyond the vague goal of coaching these children. The episode does contain two jokes connected to the death of Steve Irwin, the Australian wildlife presenter who had died from a stingray injury in September 2006, about 2 months before this episode aired. South Park had already featured a Steve Irwin joke in the season 10 episode Hell on Earth 2006, which aired earlier that season, and which had generated its own controversy. The Stanley's Cup references are smaller and less central, but they existed close enough to his death that some reviewers flagged them as misjudged. IGN gave the episode a 9.1 out of 10, praising its satire of the underdog sports movie genre and calling the ending a bold creative choice. That score represents a genuine minority view. The broader fan response is captured more accurately by where the episode sits in community rankings, consistently near the bottom of season 10 lists, frequently appearing on worst episode compilations, and almost never mentioned when fans discuss the episodes that made season 10 worth watching. Parker and Stone made the ending they made because they believed in it. That is not in question. The episode's failure is not a case of the creators not caring or rushing through something without thought. It is a case of two people having a very specific vision for an ending that almost nobody else shared. And on a show that runs a season finale, the audience's experience of that ending matters enormously. A season finale that sends people away feeling worse than when they sat down, not in the way that a genuinely dark and meaningful piece of storytelling does, but in the way that a punchline that does not land does, is a finale that did not do its job. Nelson died, the children lost, Stan got nothing, and season 10 of South Park ended on that note, in an episode that Parker and Stone themselves describe as 3/4 of a show. Quote underscore 9 underscore underscore. The next episode on this list takes a completely different approach to failure. No dark ending, no collapsed formula, no absent main cast. Just a Christmas special that forgot to be a television episode and became something else entirely. And the something else it became is considerably harder to sit through than anyone expected. Section 6, a Christmas album disguised as an episode. Quote 10, S3E15, 1999. Every television show that runs long enough eventually does a clip show. A clip show is an episode built almost entirely out of footage from previous episodes. Characters sitting around reminiscing, or some framing device that gives the production team an excuse to replay old material instead of creating anything new. Fans generally dislike clip shows because they feel like filler. They feel like the show taking a week off while still technically putting something on the air. The best thing that can be said about a clip show is that it at least reminds you of episodes you actually liked. Mr. Hankey's Christmas Classics is not technically a clip show, but but it shares the same fundamental problem. It is an episode that exists not to tell a story or make a point or do anything that a normal South Park episode does, but simply to fill a time slot with content that was already mostly finished before anyone thought about whether it belonged on television. The episode aired on December 1st, 1999. It is Season 3, Episode 15, the 45th episode of the series overall, and the most accurate description of what it actually is, rather than what it is supposed to be, is this. It is the show's Christmas album turned into a 22-minute variety special. South Park had released an actual music album called Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics in 1999. The album contained holiday songs, performed by the show's characters. The episode is essentially a visual version of that album, a collection of musical segments, one after another, loosely hosted by Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo, with the thinnest possible connective material holding the segments together. Mr. Hanky is a talking piece of feces who wears a little red hat and has been a recurring Christmas character on the show since Season 1. He exists as a symbol of the inclusive, non-denominational spirit of the holiday season in South Park, an absurd embodiment of the idea that Christmas means different things to different people, and that the town's version of Christmas spirit is, like the town itself, fundamentally strange. As a recurring character, he works well in small doses. He is warm, cheerful, and genuinely funny when the show uses him correctly. As the host of a 22-minute variety special built around musical numbers he did not write and cannot develop dramatically, he is simply a face on screen announcing the next segment. The format of the episode is straightforward. Mr. Hanky introduces a musical number. A South Park character performs a holiday song. The song ends, Mr. Hanky returns to introduce the next one. This repeats for the entire runtime. There is no plot threading through these segments. There is no story developing in the background. There is no conflict, no escalation, no resolution. The characters are not trying to do anything. Things are not getting better or worse for anyone. The episode simply presents a series of songs and then ends. Some of the songs are well-known holiday standards adapted to fit the show's characters. Mr. Garrison sings a version of Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo. Cartman sings Oh Holy Night. Kenny sings a song that cannot be understood because of his hood, which is a running joke from the show. Satan and Saddam Hussein, who had been featured together as a couple in South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut earlier that year, perform a duet. Mr. Hanky sings with his family. Kyle sings a song about being Jewish at Christmas time called The Lonely Jew on Christmas, which has become one of the more remembered pieces of music from the South Park universe over the years. That last detail is worth acknowledging. Kyle's song from this episode is genuinely good. It captures something real about the experience of being the only Jewish kid in a town that goes completely overboard on Christmas, and it does it with enough warmth and humor that it works both as comedy and as something slightly more sincere. The Lonely Jew on Christmas is probably the single best thing the episode produces, and it has been referenced and revisited enough times in South Park's broader history that its origins in this particular episode are easy to forget. But one genuinely good song does not make an episode, and the problem with Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics is not that the individual segments are all terrible. Some of them are fine, some of them are funny in the way that a decent joke in isolation is funny. The problem is that there is no episode around them. Television is not an album. When someone sits down to watch South Park, they are sitting down to watch a story, something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Something that builds, something that goes somewhere. The variety show format, where one segment ends and another begins without anything connecting them, runs completely against what the medium of television does well. It works as an album because an album is a collection of individual things meant to be experienced one at a time or shuffled freely. It does not work as a television episode because a television episode is supposed to be a unified experience. Parker and Stone have gone on record acknowledging this. Both of them have called the episode one of their worst ideas. Watch Mojo, in their ranking of the worst South Park episodes, noted that Parker and Stone both described this as among their least successful creative decisions, and that the episode functions as little more than the Christmas album it was built to promote. The episode holds a 6.9 out of 10 on IMDb, lower than almost everything in its season, and low enough to place it consistently on worst episode lists across the internet. The timing of the episode within Season 3 is also worth considering. Season 3 is a season that Parker has publicly said he is not proud of, grouping it alongside Seasons 1 and 2 as a period of the show that he would rather not revisit. His position is not that Season 3 is without good episodes. There are genuinely strong installments in that season. His position is more that the show had not yet found the precise voice and structure that would make it great, and that the work from this period reflects that uncertainty. Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics is not the only weak episode in Season 3, but it is the one that feels the most like the show losing track of what it is. is, because it does not even attempt to be a South Park episode in any recognizable sense. The episode also exists in a very particular context within the season's run. It aired as Season 3's Christmas installment, which meant it carried a specific expectation. The Christmas episode is always a notable event for South Park. The show had already produced 2 memorable Christmas specials before this one. The very first South Park episode ever aired, Mr. Hanky the Christmas Poo in Season 1, introduced Mr. Hanky and gave him a real story to exist inside. Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics, despite bearing a similar name, does not give him anything comparable. He is reduced to a host, a character standing in front of a curtain announcing what comes next, with nothing of his own to do or say or feel. There is also something specific about the variety show format that does not translate to South Park's animation style. The show's animation is built on character interaction, on the specific way these characters move through their world, react to each other, and respond to the absurd situations the show puts them in. The musical variety format removes all of that. Characters stand still and sing. The backgrounds do not change much. The physical comedy and the reaction shots that give South Park so much of its energy are almost entirely absent. What is left is a series of static images with audio layered on top, which is a reasonable description of an album cover, but not a reasonable description of a functioning television episode. The show did eventually return to Mr. Hanky for a much more dramatically developed story in Season 22, with the episode Nobody Got Cereal, as part of a longer arc about the character's offensive behavior getting him canceled from the town's Christmas festivities. That episode gave Mr. Hanky something real to do, a conflict, a consequence, a story. The difference between that version of the character and the version in Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics is the difference between a character being used well and a character being used as wallpaper. Season 3 was a difficult creative period for the show by the creator's own account. Episodes were being produced under the same brutal schedule that South Park has always operated under, written and produced within the week before they air. And the Christmas slot arrived at a moment when the team apparently decided that an adaptation of their own album was a workable solution to filling that slot. It was not. The result is an episode that fans can watch once, acknowledge the few songs that genuinely work, and then quietly never think about again. What is genuinely interesting about Mr. Hanky's Christmas Classics as a failure is that it is the least dramatic entry on this list. It did not anger anyone the way the April Fool's episode did. It did not confuse anyone the way A Million Little Fibers did. It did not depress anyone the way Stanley's Cup did. It just sat there. It played its songs, it ended. And then everyone moved on to thinking about the episodes that actually did something. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next episode on this list is different from everything covered so far. It is not a failure of story, it is not a failure of format, it is a failure of a very specific kind. An episode built around a joke that was not funny enough to support 22 minutes, constructed around a premise so narrow that it exhausted itself before anyone had finished watching, and sent out into the world anyway. And the most remarkable thing about it is not how bad it is how confidently it arrived, as if 22 minutes of the same one-note idea was exactly what the audience ordered. Section 7. The joke that ran way too long. Funny Bot. S15E2 2011. There is a specific kind of South Park episode that the show has always been capable of producing at its best. It starts with a premise that sounds completely absurd on the surface, something that has no business being the subject of a 22-minute animated comedy, and then uses that absurd premise to say something sharp and real about the world. The show has done this hundreds of times. An episode about a talking piece of feces becomes a story about religious tolerance and community belonging. An episode about a theme park becomes a meditation on the nature of happiness and whether getting what you want actually makes you happy. An episode about internet piracy becomes one of the most precise pieces of media criticism the show has ever produced. The absurd premise is never the point. It is the vehicle. The point is always something larger sitting underneath it. Funny Bot has an absurd premise. It has a vehicle. What it does not have is anything sitting underneath. The episode aired on April 27th, 2011. It is Season 15, Episode 2, the 212th episode of the series overall. It was written and directed by Trey Parker, as virtually every South Park episode is. The episode opens at South Park Elementary's first annual Comedy Awards, hosted by Jimmy Vollmer, the student with a speech impediment who has appeared in the show since Season 5 and who has been established as someone who takes comedy seriously, studies it, and considers it a meaningful craft. Jimmy announces at the ceremony that the least funny people on Earth are Germans. Germany, as a nation, hears about this and is deeply offended. The German government responds by building a robot. The robot is designed to be the funniest entity on the planet, constructed specifically to prove that Germans are capable of humor. The robot is called called FunnyBot. It is a large mechanical figure that delivers jokes in a flat, robotic voice, pausing after each punchline to say the word awkward. FunnyBot is deployed into the world and rapidly becomes enormously popular. Human comedians are threatened. Jimmy, who takes comedy more seriously than almost anything else, becomes increasingly distressed as FunnyBot dominates the entertainment landscape. The episode escalates, as South Park episodes tend to do, and FunnyBot eventually concludes that the ultimate punchline, the funniest thing it could possibly do, would be to destroy all of humanity. The episode resolves when Jimmy and the boys convince FunnyBot that the funniest thing it could do is actually to simply stop, that the most unexpected comedic choice available to a robot determined to be funny is to do nothing at all. That resolution is the clearest moment in the episode where the satirical idea underneath everything briefly surfaces. The argument the episode is making is about artificial comedy, about humor that is engineered rather than felt, produced by something that does not understand why things are funny, but can simulate the structure of a joke perfectly. FunnyBot can deliver timing and format and punchline, but it cannot understand the thing that makes comedy actually work, which is surprise, which is human, which cannot be manufactured. The moment where Jimmy talks FunnyBot down by arguing that doing nothing is funnier than doing something contains a real idea about what comedy is and where it comes from. The problem is that this idea appears in the final few minutes of the episode after 18 or so minutes of material that does not build toward it in any meaningful way. The episode does not develop the artificial comedy theme through its story. It does not use the scenes between Jimmy and FunnyBot to explore what human humor has that mechanical humor lacks. It sets up the premise, watches it escalate into a global crisis, and then arrives at the ending without having done the work that would make the ending feel earned. The satirical point is there, it just floated in at the last minute rather than being the thing the whole episode was about. The Jimmy premise itself is genuinely interesting and represents one of the more underused creative possibilities the episode had. Jimmy is a character whose relationship with comedy is unlike any other character on the show. He performs stand-up, he practices, he thinks about jokes structurally, in a way that most people do not. He genuinely loves making people laugh and has built his identity around being funny. An episode about a robot that can produce technically perfect jokes threatening everything Jimmy values, threatening the idea that comedy requires something human at its core, has real emotional and satirical potential. If the episode had stayed with Jimmy and developed his response to FunnyBot as its central concern, it could have been something genuinely sharp. Instead, the episode moves away from Jimmy fairly quickly and spends the majority of its runtime on the escalating threat of FunnyBot itself, on the robot growing more powerful, on world leaders responding to the crisis, on the mechanics of how a comedy robot decides to end humanity. This is funnier as a concept than it is in execution. The joke of a robot comedian saying awkward after each punchline lands once. It does not land 17 more times. The joke of world governments treating FunnyBot as a geopolitical threat has some initial appeal, but the episode does not do anything surprising with it. The escalation just escalates, without the kind of specific, unexpected turns that make South Park's best escalations work. TV Line, in their ranking of the worst South Park episodes, placed FunnyBot on the list and noted that the episode felt dated almost immediately upon release. This is a specific and accurate criticism. The episode's satirical target, the idea that Germans are stereotyped as humorless, is not exactly a cutting-edge cultural observation. It is a joke with a long history. And while South Park has never been above using a well-worn premise if it can do something new with it, FunnyBot does not do something new with it. The German humorlessness stereotype is the starting point of the episode, and it remains the starting point throughout. The joke does not develop or deepen or turn into something unexpected. It just sits there as the engine of a plot that goes somewhere else entirely. The episode holds a 6.9 out of 10 on IMDb. That places it among the lowest rated episodes in the show's middle seasons, seasons 11 through 16, which are generally considered a period of consistent quality in South Park's history. Finding a 6.9 in that stretch of the show is unusual. Most episodes from that era sit comfortably in the 7s and 8s. FunnyBot landing where it does reflects a real gap between what this stretch of the show was capable of and what this particular episode delivered. The season 15 context matters here. Season 15 opened with the episode Human Centipede, which aired the week before FunnyBot and is one of the more talked about episodes from that era, a parody of the horror film The Human Centipede, combined with a critique of Apple's user agreements. It is the kind of episode that demonstrates exactly what South Park can do when a sharp satirical target meets a fully developed story and committed execution. FunnyBot airing directly after that episode made the contrast more visible than it might have been otherwise. The same season, the same creative team, the same production process, and two episodes that feel like they were made with completely different levels of investment. Jimmy Valmer as a character is worth talking about specifically because his presence in this episode is one of the more frustrating aspects of it. Jimmy debuted in Season 5 in an episode called Cripple Fight. He was developed further in Season 7 in the episode Crazy Cripples, and more significantly in Season 8 in the episode Up the Down Steroid, where his use of performance-enhancing drugs at the Special Olympics became the center of a genuinely sharp story about competition, fairness, and the pressure athletes face. By the time FunnyBot arrived in Season 15, Jimmy had been established as a character with real depth, someone whose relationship with comedy, with his disability, and with his desire to be taken seriously had been developed across multiple episodes over a decade of the show. FunnyBot uses almost none of that. Jimmy's distress about FunnyBot is stated rather than shown. The audience is told he cares about comedy, and that FunnyBot threatens everything he values, but the episode does not take the time to make that threat feel personal or specific in the way that the best Jimmy episodes do. He functions primarily as the plot's mechanism for resolving the FunnyBot crisis, rather than as a character whose inner life the episode is genuinely interested in exploring. The resolution itself, Jimmy convincing FunnyBot that doing nothing is the funniest choice, works as a punchline. It is genuinely clever as a final joke, but a final joke is not the same as a satisfying ending. A satisfying ending requires that the story has built toward it in a way that makes the conclusion feel inevitable or surprising or both. The FunnyBot resolution arrives because the episode needs to end, not because the story has earned it. That is a meaningful difference, and it is the difference between an episode that sticks with you and one that you have largely forgotten by the time the credits finish. South Park at its best takes the most ridiculous possible premise and uses it to get somewhere true. FunnyBot takes a reasonably interesting premise and uses it to go in circles. The German stereotype joke does not evolve. The FunnyBot character does not develop. The Jimmy angle does not deepen. The escalation escalates for its own sake rather than in service of anything the episode is trying to say. And the final satirical point about artificial humor, while real and worth making, arrives too late and too briefly to redeem what came before it. The episode is not the worst thing South Park has ever produced. The episodes already covered in this video are more dramatically failed experiments, but FunnyBot represents a different category of disappointment. Not a creative disaster, not a production collapse, not a deliberate provocation that went wrong, just a mediocre episode on a show that is almost never mediocre, built from a premise that deserved better execution than it received. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next episode on this list shares one specific quality with FunnyBot. It is an episode where a genuinely interesting character is placed at the center of a story that does not know what to do with them. But where FunnyBot at least stays in familiar South Park territory, the next entry goes somewhere so strange and so disconnected from the show's normal world that fans and critics could not agree on whether it was bold or simply lost. Section 8, the episode that went nowhere, quote 1-4, S16E11 2012. South Park has always known what to do with Butters' stotch. That is not a small thing. Butters is one of the more complicated characters the show has produced. Not complicated in the way Cartman is complicated, where the complexity comes from darkness and manipulation, and a specific kind of intelligence that makes him dangerous. Butters is complicated in a quieter way. He is genuinely kind in a world that punishes kindness. He is trusting in a world that takes advantage of trust. He gets hurt constantly and comes back the next episode with the same open, unguarded face, ready to be hurt again. The show has used that quality to produce some of its most memorable episodes. Butters' very own episode in Season 5 is one of the darkest and most emotionally precise things South Park has ever made. Professor Chaos in Season 6 turns his endless mistreatment into something genuinely funny and surprisingly moving. Margarine in Season 9 is one of the show's most creative uses of a single character. The writers understood what made Butters work and built episodes around that understanding. Going native does not understand what makes Butters work. It takes the character, removes the qualities that make him interesting, and drops him into a story that has no idea what it wants to say about him or about anything else. The episode aired on November 7th, 2012. It is Season 16, Episode 11, the 235th episode of the series overall. Season 16 is a season that sits in the middle of South Park's run. Not the golden era of seasons 5 through 8, not the experimental serialized period of seasons 18 through 20, just a standard season of a show that had been running for 16 years and was producing episodes because that is what the show does. Most of season 16 is competent. Some of it is genuinely good. Going native is the season's clearest failure, and it is a failure specific enough to be worth examining in detail. The episode opens at school. Butters is behaving strangely. He is aggressive, angry, confrontational, calling other students names, shouting at people, pushing a kid around in a way that is completely unlike anything the character has done before. The boys notice this and are concerned. Cartman, characteristically, responds by calling Butters a turd and moving on. The school calls Butters' parents, and here is where the episode makes its first significant turn away from anything grounded. Butters' parents sit him down and reveal a secret. Butters, they explain, is not from South Park originally. His family is Hawaiian. They are descendants of the original Hawaiian people, and Butters has come of age, a point at which young Hawaiian men traditionally return to the islands to reconnect with their heritage and undergo a ritual of passage into adulthood. His aggressive behavior is the sign that this time has come. His body and his spirit are calling him home to Hawaii. Kenny is assigned to accompany Butters on this journey. The two of them travel to Hawaii together. The rest of the episode takes place on the island, where Butters meets other native Hawaiians, participates in their traditions, and eventually completes whatever the episode considers a meaningful cultural experience. Kenny observes this happening and drinks heavily throughout, which functions as the episode's primary source of comedy. Kenny at a resort bar getting increasingly drunk while Butters goes through his cultural awakening nearby. That description already reveals the central problem. The episode's story hinges entirely on a reveal, Butters is secretly Hawaiian, that has no foundation in anything the show had ever established about the character. Butters' Stotch has appeared in South Park since season 4. His parents, Steven and Linda Stotch, have been recurring characters throughout the series. His home in South Park, his school, his neighborhood, his relationships, all of it has been built up across dozens of episodes over more than a decade. None of that history contains any hint of a Hawaiian heritage, or any suggestion that Butters has a cultural identity separate from the small Colorado mountain town he has always lived in. The reveal does not recontextualize anything from the show's past. It simply arrives, unexplained and unsupported, and asks the audience to accept it as the foundation of the entire episode. South Park has always operated with a loose relationship to continuity. Characters die and come back. Facts established in one episode are ignored in another. The show has never claimed to be carefully building a consistent world where every detail lines up, but there is a difference between the kind of continuity looseness that South Park uses for comic effect and the kind that Going Native employs. When Kenny dies and returns the next episode, that is a running joke with a long history. The audience understands the rule being broken and finds the breaking of it funny. When Butters is revealed to be secretly Hawaiian with no setup, no history, and no comic payoff, it is not a joke about continuity. It is just a plot device that the episode needed and grabbed without earning. The Hawaiian cultural portrayal in the episode drew criticism from viewers who felt it was lazy and relied on surface-level stereotypes rather than anything specific or observed. The native Hawaiians Butters encounters on the island are not developed as characters. They exist to facilitate Butters' ritual passage and then disappear. The ritual itself is not given enough detail to feel meaningful or even clearly absurd in the way South Park's best cultural parodies work. The episode is not really interested in Hawaii. It is interested in getting Butters to Hawaii so that something can happen there, but it never fully decides what that something is or why it matters. Kenny's role in the episode is the clearest example of wasted potential. Kenny is a character who has been used brilliantly in certain episodes. His death and resurrection arc, his role in Mysterion Rises, his quiet presence in episodes where he functions as the emotional center rather than the comic relief. Going Native pairs him with Butters for a road trip episode, which sounds like an interesting combination. Two of the show's most underserved main characters, placed together in an unusual situation, with room to develop something between them. The episode does not develop anything between them. Kenny drinks, Butters does his ritual. They exist in the same location without their stories meaningfully connecting. By the end of the episode, their pairing has produced nothing that required both of them to be there together. The episode holds one of the lower IMDb ratings from season 16, sitting in the range that signals genuine fan dissatisfaction rather than simple indifference. Collider, in their ranking of the worst South Park episodes according to IMDb scores, included Going Native with the note that while the episode has some worth for fans who enjoy Butters and Kenny, it is not funny or dramatically interesting enough to qualify as anything more than a forgettable entry in the show's history. Even that measured defense is a weak one. Worth watching because it has Butters and Kenny in it is a very low bar for an episode of a show that has produced as much genuinely excellent Butters material as South Park has. The broader Season 16 context is worth noting. Season 16 contains Cash for Gold, which is a sharp and focused critique of the home shopping industry and the exploitation of elderly people. It contains Cartman Finds Love, which does something genuinely surprising with the Cartman and Token dynamic. It contains Raising the Bar, which is one of the more ambitious episodes the show produced in that period, a meditation on the lowering of cultural standards, featuring James Cameron as a character who literally raises a bar from the bottom of the ocean. Going Native airing in the same season as those episodes makes its emptiness more visible. The writers were clearly capable of focused, sharp, purposeful television during Season 16. This particular episode just did not receive that focus. There is also something specifically frustrating about the episode from a character perspective. Butters is at his best when the show is honest about what his kindness costs him, when the gap between how he sees the world and how the world actually treats him is the source of both the comedy and whatever emotional weight the episode carries. Going Native removes that dynamic entirely by placing Butters in a situation where people are welcoming and accepting and his heritage is celebrated. There is no friction, there is no cost. Butters goes to Hawaii, is recognized as one of the native people, undergoes a ritual, and is embraced. That is a story without tension, and a Butters story without tension is a Butters story that has misunderstood the character. Parker and Stone have not publicly singled out Going Native for specific criticism the way they have with episodes like A Million Little Fibers or Pip. It is not an episode they have gone on record wanting to erase. It simply exists in the show's catalog as one of the quieter failures. Not dramatic enough to generate strong reactions in either direction, not memorable enough to be discussed frequently, and not successful enough at what it was trying to do to be worth revisiting. The episodes that produce the most heated fan responses tend to be the ones that attempted something bold and failed. Going Native does not have that defense. It does not appear to have been attempting anything particularly bold. It appears to have been an episode that needed to fill a slot in Season 16 and filled it with something that did not work. What the episode needed, most fundamentally, was a reason to exist. Every South Park episode worth watching has a reason to exist, a point it is trying to make, a joke it is building toward, a satirical target it has identified and chosen to go after with precision. Going Native does not have a reason to exist that is visible anywhere in the finished product. It has a premise, it has characters, it has a location. It does not have a purpose. Underscore underscore quote underscore 15 underscore underscore underscore. The next section covers an episode with a very different problem. Where Going Native suffered from having nothing to say, the episode coming up next had plenty to say, but what it chose to say and how it chose to say it created a reaction that has only grown more complicated with time. It is an episode that cannot be separated from the cultural moment it was made in, and watching it now feels like looking at a piece of the show's history that the show itself would rather you forgot. Section 9. The one that aged worst. Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina. Season 9, Episode 1, 2005. Season premieres carry weight. They are the first thing a show puts in front of its audience after a break. The episode that sets the tone for everything that follows, that tells the viewer what kind of season they are about to watch, that makes the case for why the show is still worth their time. The best South Park season premieres do exactly that. They arrive with confidence, establish a clear target, and demonstrate within the first few minutes that the writers have something specific and pointed to say. Season 9 opened on March 9th, 2005, and the episode that greeted returning viewers was Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, a title that tells you almost everything you need to know about what the episode is willing to do, and almost nothing about whether it does it well. The episode is built around Mr. Garrison, the boy's teacher who has been a recurring character since the very first episode of the series. Mr. Garrison has always been one of South Park's more unpredictable characters. In the early seasons, he was primarily a vehicle for jokes about repressed homosexuality, presented as a man who could not admit what he was and took that frustration out on everyone around him. In Season 4, 4, the episode Do the Handicapped Go to Hell revealed that Garrison was gay. In Season 5, the episode The Death Camp of Tolerance pushed that story further. By the time Season 9 arrived, the character had been through a significant amount of development, more than most South Park characters receive, and his identity had been a source of recurring storylines for years. Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina opens with Mr. Garrison deciding to undergo gender reassignment surgery. He travels to a clinic, the procedure is performed, and he returns as Mrs. Garrison, a woman, by his own declaration, ready to experience life from a new perspective. The episode then splits into multiple storylines running at the same time. Kyle wants to try out for the Colorado State basketball team, but is told he cannot because he is not tall enough and not black. Kyle decides to undergo surgery to change both of these things, having his legs extended and melanin injected into his skin to darken it. Gerald, Kyle's father, discovers what Kyle has done and undergoes his own surgery to become a dolphin, a species he has always felt he truly was inside. All three of these storylines are running the same joke from different angles. The joke is about the gap between what someone feels they are on the inside and what they actually are on the outside, and specifically about the idea that surgery can bridge that gap. Mr. Garrison feels he is a woman inside. Kyle feels he is tall and black inside. Gerald feels he is a dolphin inside. The episode treats all three of these as equivalent, which is the central creative and moral choice the episode is making, and it is the choice that has made the episode increasingly difficult to discuss as the years have passed. The episode includes extended footage of an actual gender reassignment surgical procedure. This footage is real, not animated, not suggested, but shown in clinical detail within the episode. Parker and Stone made the deliberate choice to include this material, and by South Park standards, the decision is consistent with the show's broader approach to using shock and discomfort as tools. The show has never been shy about putting things on screen that most other television programs would not touch. That is part of its identity and part of what has made it culturally significant for nearly 3 decades. The specific problem with Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina is not the shock content in isolation. South Park has produced shock content that works, content that is genuinely disturbing or transgressive in service of a real satirical point that justifies the discomfort. The problem is what the episode does with its premise once it has established it. The three-way comparison, transgender woman, kid who wants to be a different race, man who wants to be a dolphin, is a satirical structure. It is making an argument. And the argument it is making is that these three things are equivalent. That wanting to change your gender, wanting to change your race, and wanting to become a different species are all versions of the same kind of thinking. That argument has aged in a very specific direction. In 2005, the cultural conversation around transgender identity was significantly different from where it stands today. The vocabulary was different, the public understanding was different, the medical and psychological frameworks that inform how society talks about gender identity now were not as widely understood or as publicly discussed. An episode that was made in 2005 as a broad satirical take on a cultural phenomenon it did not fully understand was always going to look different when viewed from a later point in time, when that cultural conversation had moved considerably further. Screen Rant ranked Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina as one of the worst South Park episodes, specifically on the basis of how it holds up in retrospect, calling it one of the few episodes that is genuinely difficult to revisit. That assessment reflects the episode's primary legacy. Not that it was a creative disaster when it aired, but that it represents a version of South Park's approach to a subject that the show itself has since revisited from different angles, with different levels of understanding and care. The character of Mr. Garrison continued through multiple seasons, identifying as Mrs. Garrison after this episode. The show did not simply use the premise for one episode and move on. Mrs. Garrison remained a recurring presence through seasons 9, 10, 11, and 12, eventually reverting to identifying as Mr. Garrison again in season 12. The long arc of the character's gender identity across these seasons was handled with varying degrees of thoughtfulness. Some episodes engaged with it more carefully than others, but the episode that started the whole arc, Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina, remains the least carefully handled version of the story the show told about this character. The episode's comedy largely rests on the physical details of the surgical procedures, on showing the clinical reality of what these transformations involve and asking the audience to find the gap between the character's desire and the medical reality of satisfying it funny. The Kyle storyline plays this for fairly straightforward, absurdist laughs. A small Jewish kid having his legs extended and his skin darkened to play basketball is ridiculous in a way that is fairly clear in its satirical intent, targeting the idea that sports success in America is tied to specific physical and racial characteristics. The Gerald dolphin surgery storyline is similarly absurdist and functions primarily as an escalation of the episode's central joke. These two storylines are easier to watch now than the Garrison storyline because they are not making the same kind of direct comparison to a real group of people's real experiences. The episode holds a lower rating in fan retrospectives than it does on IMDb itself, where it sits in the mid-7 range, higher than the episodes covered earlier in this video, but consistently identified in critical and fan discussions as one of the most problematic entries in the show's catalog. The gap between the IMDb number and the critical consensus is partly explained by the fact that many of the IMDb ratings were given closer to when the episode aired, when the cultural context around the subject matter was different. Reviews and rankings produced more recently tend to be considerably harsher. It is also worth noting what the episode did to Mrs. Garrison as a character going forward. The show introduced a version of Mr. Garrison who had undergone a profound personal change, and then did not know what to do with that character for several seasons. Mrs. Garrison's storylines in seasons 9 through 12 are inconsistent in tone and purpose. Sometimes the character's identity is treated with something approaching genuine engagement, sometimes it is used purely as a punchline, and the two approaches sit uncomfortably next to each other, without the show ever fully resolving which one it is committed to. The lack of a clear creative vision for where the character was going after this episode is visible in how the show struggled with Mrs. Garrison across multiple seasons before simply reverting the character to Mr. Garrison without much ceremony. South Park has produced better episodes about identity, about bodies, about the gap between how people see themselves and how the world sees them. The show is capable of handling these subjects with more precision than this episode demonstrates. The fact that Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina exists as the show's first sustained engagement with transgender identity as a subject makes its failures more significant than they might otherwise be. It set a template that the show then had to either build on or walk back, and the years that followed suggest the writers were not entirely sure which direction they wanted to go. The episode aired as a season premiere, which means it was the first thing a returning audience saw after the Season 8 break. Season 8 had ended strongly. The audience came back for Season 9 and received this as their welcome. That is not the strongest possible opening statement for a season, and the episode's legacy has only become more complicated as the cultural conversation it was engaging with has developed in directions the writers of 2005 could not fully anticipate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What comes next on this list is an episode from an entirely different era of the show, a season that represents one of South Park's most ambitious and most thoroughly collapsed creative experiments. Where earlier entries on this list failed in isolation, the next section is about a failure that infected an entire season, episode by episode, until the whole structure fell apart under its own weight. Section 10, Season 20's Low Point, Wieners Out, S20E4, 2016. There is a version of ambition that works and a version that does not. The version that works is when a show pushes itself into unfamiliar territory, takes a genuine creative risk, and comes out the other side with something that justifies the gamble. South Park has done this many times. The serialized two-part episodes, the movie, the seasons that took on massive cultural targets with enough precision to actually land. All of these are examples of the show betting on itself and winning. The version of ambition that does not work is when a show pushes itself into unfamiliar territory, commits completely to a structure it cannot fully control, and then watches that structure collapse in real time while the episodes keep airing because there is no way to stop them. That is what Season 20 was, and Wieners Out is the episode that most clearly shows what the collapse looked like from the inside. Season 20 of South Park premiered on September 14th, 2016. It was the show's most aggressively serialized season season to that point, every episode connecting directly to the ones before and after it, with ongoing storylines that were designed to build across the entire run rather than resolve within individual episodes. Parker and Stone had experimented with serialization before, particularly in seasons 18 and 19, but season 20 committed to it more completely than anything they had attempted previously. The entire season was conceived as one long story, with multiple interlocking plot threads running simultaneously, all of them theoretically converging toward a meaningful conclusion. The threads going into season 20 were numerous and complicated. Gerald Broflovsky, Kyle's father, a character who had appeared in the show since season 1 primarily as a background parent figure, was revealed to be an internet troll, spending his nights anonymously harassing people online under the name SkankHunt42. This was Gerald's first major storyline in the entire history of the show. A mysterious figure called the Troll Hunter was tracking Gerald down. A Memberberries subplot involved small fruit that caused people to feel nostalgia for the past, specifically the kind of dangerous nostalgia that makes people want to return to worse times. Mr. Garrison was running for president as a clear stand-in for Donald Trump, who was at that point the actual Republican candidate in the 2016 presidential election. Cartman had entered a relationship with Heidi Turner. Butters had become a misogynistic activist after being hurt by a girl. Kyle was apologizing to Cartman for things that Cartman had done to him. The boys were at war with the girls over an ongoing conflict about gender and online behavior. Every single one of these threads required careful management. Every single one of them needed to develop in a way that made sense, that paid off what had been set up, and that eventually connected to the others in a satisfying way. Running this many simultaneous stories in a show that produces episodes in 6 days, writing and animating each one within the week before it airs, with no ability to go back and adjust earlier episodes once they have aired, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Parker and Stone had managed versions of this in previous seasons. Season 20 broke them. Wiener's Out aired on October 19th, 2016. It is season 20, episode 4, the 271st episode of the series overall. By this point in the season, the multiple storylines were already showing signs of strain. The episode's central plot follows Butters, who has decided to lead a movement in which the boys of South Park Elementary protest the ongoing conflict with the girls by exposing themselves, walking around school with their pants down as an act of defiance. Butters frames this as a statement about male vulnerability, about how boys are expected to hide their feelings the same way they are expected to hide their bodies. The protest generates exactly the kind of chaos and misunderstanding that South Park usually navigates with more comic precision than this episode manages. The Butters characterization in this episode is one of the most commonly cited problems with season 20 as a whole. Butters, a character defined throughout the show's history by his genuine kindness, his fundamental decency, and his willingness to believe the best of people even when those people are actively hurting him, had been transformed across the early episodes of season 20 into something that does not match anything the show had previously established about him. He had become bitter and resentful toward girls specifically, organizing the boys' side of the gender conflict with a level of hostility that sits completely outside his established character. The show offered no gradual transition, no episode that showed Butters developing this bitterness in a way that connected to who he had always been. He simply arrived in season 20 as a different version of himself, and the show expected the audience to accept this. This is part of a broader pattern across the season that fans identified early and consistently. The out-of-character behavior was not limited to Butters. Cartman falling into a genuine, sincere romantic relationship with Heidi Turner, behaving in ways that stripped him of the selfishness and manipulation that define him as a character, produced a version of Cartman that many fans did not recognize. Kyle apologizing to Cartman, reversing the moral dynamic between the two characters that the show had maintained for nearly 2 decades, felt wrong in a way that the season never adequately justified. Gerald's transformation into a gleeful internet troll, a character who had previously been established as a principled, if flawed adult, required an explanation the show never fully provided. The reason all of this happened is directly connected to something that occurred in November 2016, partway through the season's production. Donald Trump won the presidential election. Parker and Stone had written, and in some cases already animated episodes that assumed Hillary Clinton would win. The Garrison as Trump storyline had been building toward a resolution predicated on Trump losing, on the character of Garrison winning the presidency as a joke about how absurd the election had become, with the underlying assumption that the real version of this story would end differently. When Trump actually won, the entire second half of the season's planned structure became unusable. Parker and Stone have spoken about this directly. They said they had to rush to revise episodes after the election result came in. Stone acknowledged that they were not prepared for the Trump outcome in terms of what it meant for the season's story. story. The episodes that aired after November 8, 2016 were produced under emergency conditions, not the normal extreme pressure of South Park's week-by-week production, but an additional layer of crisis on top of that existing pressure. The result is visible in the finished episodes. Multiple storylines that had been built up across the first half of the season were abandoned without resolution. The Memberberry subplot, which had been positioned as one of the season's central satirical ideas, essentially disappeared. The Troll Hunter story concluded in a way that felt rushed and undercooked. The Cartman and Heidi relationship, which had been set up as a long arc, resolved in ways that contradicted what had been established earlier. Wiener's Out sits at the specific point in the season where the weight of all these unresolved threads is already making itself felt, even before the election collapse. The episode is trying to advance the gender conflict storyline, develop the Butters misogyny arc, continue the Gerald troll storyline, and maintain the Cartman and Heidi relationship, all within 22 minutes, all without the kind of focused storytelling that any one of these threads would require to land properly. The result is an episode that moves through plot points without developing any of them, checking boxes rather than telling a story. The gender conflict itself, the central subject of the episode, is handled with less precision than South Park usually brings to social satire. The show is at its best on gender and social politics when it has a specific, identifiable target and enough distance from that target to see it clearly. Wiener's Out arrives at a moment when the cultural conversation about online harassment, gender dynamics, and social media behavior is moving faster than the show's 6-day production schedule can track. The satirical points the episode is trying to make are either too broad to land with impact or too tied to specific cultural moments that the episode does not fully contextualize. The season as a whole holds the distinction of being widely considered the show's weakest full season by a significant portion of the fan community. Individual episode ratings from season 20 are lower across the board than almost any other season in the show's history. Wiener's Out is not the only weak episode in the season. It is one of many, all of which suffered from the same structural collapse. But it is frequently singled out because it represents the season's problems in concentrated form. Out-of-character behavior, too many unresolved threads, satirical targets that the episode cannot quite reach, and a central joke, boys walking around with their pants down as political protest, that is not developed enough to carry even the portion of the episode it is supposed to anchor. Parker and Stone later acknowledged that they had reached a point with the Trump-focused political content where they simply ran out of things to say. They said publicly that they had done too many election-focused seasons and could not find new angles. That honesty is consistent with how both creators have always talked about their own work, directly, without much defensiveness, willing to name what did not work even when the work is their own. Season 20 was the fullest expression of that kind of creative exhaustion, and Wiener's Out is where that exhaustion is most visible in a single episode. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What comes next on this list is an episode that failed for an entirely different reason. Not creative exhaustion, not structural collapse under the weight of too many storylines. Just a premise that arrived several years too late to say anything relevant about the moment it was trying to capture. Built around characters who had already been used more effectively in an earlier episode that the show had apparently forgotten it made. Section 11. The Goth episode nobody needed. Goth Kids 3, Dawn of the Posers. Season 17, Episode 4, 2013. Timing is everything in comedy. A joke delivered one beat too early does not land. A joke delivered one beat too late does not land either. The same principle applies to satire at the episode level. A South Park episode targeting a specific cultural moment needs to arrive at the right time to have any impact at all. Too early and the audience does not have enough context to understand what is being targeted. Too late and the audience has already moved on, already processed the moment being satirized, already stopped caring about it in the way that good satire requires them to care. The gap between those two failure modes is narrow, and South Park has mostly stayed inside it across its history. The show's 6-day production schedule is part of what makes that possible. The ability to write, animate, and air an episode within the same week means the show can respond to cultural events almost in real time. Goth Kids 3, Dawn of the Posers did not use that speed. It arrived late, not by a few weeks, but by years, and the distance between when the episode aired and when its targets were actually actually relevant is the single biggest reason the episode failed as completely as it did. The episode aired on October 23rd, 2013. It is season 17, episode 4, the 243rd episode of the series overall. The title positions it as the third entry in a Goth Kids series, a continuation of previous episodes that featured the Goth Kids as their central characters. The most significant of those previous episodes was The Ungroundable, which aired in season 12 in 2008. That episode is the direct predecessor to this one, and understanding why The Ungroundable worked is essential to understanding why Goth Kids 3 does not. The Ungroundable aired in November 2008 and centered on Butters joining the Vampire Kids, a group of South Park Elementary students who had become obsessed with the Twilight book and film series, dressing in dark clothing, wearing fake fangs, and calling themselves vampires. The Goth Kids, who had been a recurring presence in the show since season 7, were outraged by this. Their identity was built on being different, on existing outside the mainstream, on being the dark and misunderstood group that nobody else understood. And suddenly there was another dark and misunderstood group that looked almost identical to them from the outside. Except the Vampire Kids were mainstream, because Twilight was at that point one of the biggest cultural phenomena on the planet. The Goth Kids had to distinguish themselves from something that superficially resembled them but was actually the opposite of everything they stood for. That episode worked for several reasons. Twilight was everywhere in 2008. The first film had just released, the books were selling in enormous numbers, the specific cultural phenomenon being targeted was alive and active at the exact moment the episode arrived. Butters at the center of the story gave it an emotional anchor. His earnest belief that he was actually a vampire, his sincere participation in the Vampire Kids' rituals, provided the episode with something warm and funny to balance against the Goth Kids' furious pretension. And the satirical point, that the line between genuinely alternative and mainstream alternative is thinner than either side wants to admit, was sharp enough to give the episode something real to say. Goth Kids 3. Dawn of the Posers takes the same characters and the same general setup, Goth Kids and Vampire Kids navigating their identities in relation to each other, and attempts to add a third group into the conflict. The episode introduces Emo Kids, framing them as a threat to both the Goth Kids and the Vampire Kids. One of the Goth Kids is sent to a camp for troubled children and returns transformed. She has become emo, wearing tighter clothes, listening to different music, crying in a different stylistic way than the Goths cry. The remaining Goth Kids treat this as a crisis. They work with the Vampire Kids to investigate the camp and figure out what happened to their friend. The problem begins with the satirical target. The episode is poking fun at the differences between goth culture, emo culture, and the Twilight vampire aesthetic. These are real distinctions that real teenagers in the mid-2000s cared about deeply and argued about at length. The bands associated with emo music, My Chemical Romance being the most prominent example, were at their cultural peak somewhere around 2006 and 2007. The specific aesthetic the episode is targeting, the tight black clothing and the emotional intensity, and the particular way emo culture presented itself as distinct from goth culture, was a genuine cultural conversation happening among teenagers at a very specific moment in time. That moment was not 2013. By the time Goth Kids 3 aired, the emo wave had largely passed. My Chemical Romance, the band most strongly associated with the emo aesthetic the episode references, had broken up in March 2013, 7 months before this episode aired. The Twilight film series had concluded in November 2012, with the final installment performing significantly below the earlier films in the franchise. The cultural conversation about the differences between goth, emo, and vampire-obsessed teenagers had been largely settled by the time the episode arrived. Not because anyone had reached a satisfying conclusion, but because the audience had simply moved on. Teenagers who had been deeply invested in these identity distinctions in 2007 were now in their early 20s. The kids who would have found this episode's satirical target immediately recognizable and personally relevant were no longer the age that South Park typically speaks to most directly. TV Line's review of the episode noted specifically that it felt dated upon arrival. Not dated in the way that some South Park episodes age poorly over time, but dated in the sense that it felt like a relic of a cultural moment that had already ended before the episode existed. That is a different and more damaging kind of outdated. An episode that ages poorly at least had the benefit of being timely when it first aired. Goth Kids 3 did not have that benefit. It arrived as a period piece without intending to be one. The been there, done that quality of the episode, identified by TV line and echoed by fan responses, is compounded by the direct comparison to the ungroundable. The earlier episode had done the same basic thing more effectively 5 years prior. It had the same characters. It had the same central conflict about identity and authenticity. It had a sharper satirical target, a more active cultural context, and Butters at the center providing emotional texture that this episode lacks. Goth Kids 3 does not have Butters. It does not have a character playing the equivalent role, someone outside the goth and vampire kid groups whose involvement gives the story warmth and human weight. The episode stays entirely within the world of the subcultural groups it is satirizing, which means the audience has nothing familiar to hold on to while the goth kids investigate the emo camp. The investigation plot itself is constructed as a parody of horror movie conventions. The mysterious camp, the transformation of a friend into something unrecognizable, the group working together to uncover a conspiracy. These horror movie elements are applied to the context of teenage subcultural identity with a lightness that suggests the episode knows it is working with tired material and is trying to refresh it through genre blending. The effort is visible. The result is an episode that is neither a sharp subcultural satire nor a particularly effective horror parody, sitting awkwardly between the two without committing fully to either. The goth kids as characters have always been a specific and limited comedic resource. Their humor comes from their complete, unwavering commitment to their own pretension, the way they insist on their darkness and their uniqueness while being children in a small Colorado mountain town who go home to their parents' houses and eat dinner and wake up the next morning for school. That gap between how they see themselves and the reality of what they are is funny when the show uses it precisely. In The Ungroundable, the Twilight phenomenon pushing in on their identity gave that pretension something real to push back against. In Goth Kids 3, the emo threat is too thin and too late to generate the same friction. The vampire kids, who had been a genuinely funny presence in The Ungroundable because of Butters' complete sincerity in believing he was actually a vampire, are considerably less funny here without that anchor. They appear as one side of a three-way conflict between subcultural groups, each of which is indistinguishable from the others in any meaningful way to anyone who did not live through the specific cultural moment when these distinctions actually mattered. For a viewer in 2013 who had not been a teenager during the emo peak of 2006 and 2007, the episode offers very little entry point. For a viewer who had been that teenager, the episode arrives too late to say anything they had not already thought and moved past. Season 17 overall is not considered one of South Park's weaker seasons. It contains Black Friday, which is one of the most ambitious parody episodes the show produced in that era. A 3-part Game of Thrones parody that used the Black Friday shopping phenomenon as its backdrop and was received very warmly by both fans and critics. Finding Goth Kids 3 in the same season as Black Friday demonstrates the range of quality that a single South Park season can contain, and how dramatically the show's results can vary from one episode to the next, even within the same production period. The episode is not the kind of failure that generates heat. It is not offensive in a way that makes people angry. It is not strange in a way that makes people confused. It is simply an episode that arrived too late, said things that had already been said better, targeted a cultural moment that had already ended, and left no impression that justified its existence. That kind of failure is in some ways harder to examine than the more dramatic ones. There is nothing to push against. The episode just sat down in 2013, looked around at a cultural landscape that had already moved past what it was trying to talk about, and quietly failed to matter. __quote_21___. The final section of this video covers a different kind of late arrival. Not an episode that missed its cultural moment by years, but a season finale that missed the mark in almost every direction at once, leaving a short and already disappointing season on the lowest possible note. Section 12, the season finale that fizzled. Quote 22, Season 26, Episode 6, 2023. Every show that runs long enough eventually has to answer the same question. Not out loud, not in any official statement, but through the work itself, through what it chooses to put on screen and what it chooses to say about the world it is living in. The question is simple. Does this still matter? Not in the abstract sense of whether the show has value or whether its history is significant. In the immediate, practical sense of whether the episode airing right now has something to say that justifies the time being asked of the audience. The best South Park episodes answer that question before it is even asked. They arrive with such clarity of purpose and such precision of target that the relevance is obvious from the first minute. The weakest episodes force the question into the open by failing to answer it. Spring Break, the season 26 finale, forces the question wide open and then sits there unable to respond. The episode aired on May 24th, 2023. It is season 26, episode 6, the final episode of the season and the 329th episode of the series overall. Season 26 was unusually short, 6 episodes. For a show that had historically produced 14 episodes per season as its standard output, 6 episodes represents a significant reduction. The reasons for shorter seasons in South Park's more recent years connect to the broader changes in how the show is produced and distributed. The deals with Paramount Plus, the production of longer special episodes that sit outside the regular season structure, and the general shift in how television content is packaged and released in the streaming era. A 6-episode season carries more weight per episode than a 14-episode season does. With fewer episodes to make a season feel complete, each one matters more. The finale matters most of all. Spring Break uses its finale slot to tell 2 separate stories simultaneously, neither of which builds to anything that feels worth the investment. The first story follows Mr. Garrison and a character named Rick, who travel together to Myrtle Beach in South Carolina to participate in Spring Break. Mr. Garrison has been through more character transformations than almost anyone else in South Park's history. Teacher, woman, back to man, president of the United States in the show's version of the 2016 election, and various other configurations across 26 seasons. By season 26, the show's version of Garrison was in a post-presidency period, and the episode uses Spring Break as an opportunity to revisit his relationship with the kind of depraved, chaotic behavior that defined his arc during the Trump presidency seasons. The episode frames his Spring Break activities as an addiction. The same way a person might be addicted to substances, Garrison is addicted to the atmosphere of political rallies and the behavior associated with them. The second story keeps Randy Marsh at home in South Park with Stan, while Sharon and the rest of the family go on vacation. Randy, left alone with his son, begins exploring the kind of ideas about masculinity that the episode associates with figures like Andrew Tate, the British-American internet personality who became one of the most discussed and most controversial social media presences of 2022 and early 2023, primarily for his statements about gender roles, male dominance, and what he described as the proper relationship between men and women. Randy absorbs these ideas and begins practicing them at home, presenting himself to Stan as a man who is finally understanding what masculinity really means, while Stan watches with the mixture of embarrassment and resignation that has characterized his relationship with his father for most of the show's run. Both of these satirical targets, political rally addiction as a stand-in for the Trump phenomenon and Andrew Tate-style masculinity influencer culture, are real and identifiable. They are the kinds of targets South Park has built its reputation on going after. The problem is not that the targets are unworthy. The problem is that the episode does not actually go after them. It identifies them, points at them, and then stands there without delivering the kind of specific, cutting observation that makes South Park satire work. Screen Rant's review of the episode was direct about this, noting that the episode completely fails to make any kind of meaningful point with its Andrew Tate parody. The Randy storyline in particular was identified as an opportunity that the episode sets up and then does not follow through on. Randy espousing ideas about masculinity and being questioned about them by the people around him, including Stan, who functions throughout the series as the show's moral center in the way that Kyle functions in other storylines, should produce something. It should produce a joke sharp enough to cut, or a moment of genuine satirical precision, or at minimum a payoff that justifies the setup. The episode produces none of these things. Randy talks about masculinity, people around him react. Nothing is revealed, nothing is developed. The storyline ends without having said anything that the premise did not already contain. The Garrison storyline at Myrtle Beach has the same problem at a slightly different angle. The idea of positioning political rally attendance as an addiction, framing the compulsive participation in partisan political events as a psychological dependency similar to substance abuse, has genuine satirical potential. It captures something real about how political identity functions for certain people, and about how the atmosphere of large, charged political gatherings can become something people crave in a way that looks from the outside like addiction. But the episode does not develop this idea. It states hates it. Garrison goes to Myrtle Beach. He participates in spring break behavior that mirrors the energy of a political rally. He enjoys it. The episode ends. The satirical point that was implied by the premise is never actually made with enough specificity to mean anything. Collider's assessment of the episode identified it as the low point of season 26, describing it as recycling jokes and ideas that no longer felt fresh. That word, recycled, is the right one for what spring break feels like. The Garrison as Trump material had been a central feature of South Park for seasons 19 through 21. By season 26, the show had been doing versions of this for 7 years. The Randy as confused adult man absorbing bad ideas material is one of the show's most frequently used structures. Randy has spent a significant portion of the show's run being the vehicle for satirical takes on whatever bad idea is currently circulating among American adults. Both of these wells are not dry, but they require fresh water to produce anything useful. Spring break does not bring fresh water. It returns to both wells with the same bucket it has been using for years, and comes up with less than it used to. Season 26 as a whole had been a disappointment relative to expectations. The Paramount Plus deal had generated significant attention and genuine anticipation among the show's fan base. The specials produced for the streaming platform had been mixed in quality, but had at least demonstrated that Parker and Stone were willing to experiment with longer formats and more ambitious stories. 6 regular episodes to close out the season, ending with spring break, felt to many fans like the show going through motions it had gone through many times before without finding a new way through them. The specific failure of spring break as a season finale is also about what a season finale is supposed to do. A finale is the last impression a season leaves. It is the episode that sits in the audience's memory across the gap between the last episode of one season and the first episode of the next. The best South Park finales use their position to do something that lingers. A satirical point with enough weight to stay with the viewer, a narrative development that changes the landscape going into the next season, or simply a joke so precisely executed that it becomes the thing people remember when they think about that period of the show. Spring break does none of these things. It ends. The Garrison storyline concludes without a memorable payoff. The Randy storyline concludes without a memorable payoff. The season is over, and the primary impression left behind is that it could have been better. The episode also suffers from a structural problem that compounds the satirical emptiness. The two storylines, Garrison at Myrtle Beach and Randy at home, do not connect to each other in any meaningful way. They run parallel through the episode without intersecting, without informing each other, without the kind of thematic conversation between storylines that the best multi-thread South Park episodes create. The Garrison and Randy stories are both about adult men behaving in ways that are presented as regressive or self-destructive, which gives them a surface similarity. But surface similarity is not the same as structural connection, and the episode does not do the work of making both stories feel like parts of the same argument. Parker and Stone have not given extended public commentary on spring break specifically in the way they have reflected on earlier failures like A Million Little Fibers or Pip. This is partly a matter of timing. The episode is recent enough that the kind of retrospective interviews where creators discuss their weaker work have not yet happened. But the silence itself is informative. The episodes that Parker and Stone have spoken most extensively about are the ones that generated the strongest reactions. The April Fool's episode that made fans furious, the Towley episode they both want to erase, the Pip episode that everyone, including the creators, hated. Spring break has not generated that kind of strong reaction. It has generated the quieter and in some ways more concerning response of simply being forgotten, of being the episode at the end of a short season that most fans moved past without it leaving much of a mark. The show was renewed through 2027 with new episodes continuing to produce. Season 27 premiered in October 2025, giving the show another opportunity to be the version of itself that made spring break look like a low point rather than a direction. South Park has recovered from weak seasons and weak finales before. Season 20's collapse was followed by seasons that showed the show finding its footing again. The capacity for recovery has always been part of what makes South Park's longevity remarkable. The show is bad at being bad for long stretches, and its worst episodes tend to be isolated failures rather than signs of permanent decline. Spring Break is the most recent entry on this list, which means it sits closest to where the show is right now. It is a reminder that even a show with nearly 3 decades of history and hundreds of genuinely excellent episodes can produce something that answers the question of whether it still matters with a shrug instead of an argument. The shrug is not the end of the conversation, but it is for now where this particular episode left things. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.